All right, welcome to Planning, Conducting, and Communicating Library Assessment and Overview. This is part of a series of online discussions brought to you by the ACRL University Library Section's Professional Development Committee. I am Jason Martin, Chair of the committee, and I'll be moderating this program along with my colleagues Alex Deek and Taylor McNair. A couple of announcements. This is an ongoing series of online programs sponsored by our committee over the course of the year, and I'm going to give out more information at the end about some upcoming programs that we have. So if you're interested in that, please stick around. This session is being recorded, and when the recording is ready, we will send out the link to everyone who has registered for the program. The program will consist of approximately 45 minutes of presentation from our panelists, followed by a question and answer session. As our panelists are speaking, please feel free to ask your questions in the chat box, which is in the bottom right corner of your screen, and we'll collect those questions as you ask them, and then at the end we will answer those, as many as we can get to. We'll also be asking for your feedback on today's program. So at the end of the session, we'll send out a link to get your feedback on today's program. So with those announcements out of the way, I'm very happy to get this session started. We are joined today by three outstanding assessment librarians. They are Dr. Starr Hoffman, who is the Director of Planning and Assessment at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas Libraries. She was previously head of the Journalism Library at Columbia University and the head of Government Documents at University of North Texas. Starr's research interests center around assessment and planning, library leadership, and research support services. She edited the recent book, Dynamic Research Support for Academic Libraries, available through ALA Editions. Ebony Magnus is the Assessment and User Experience Librarian at the Southern Alberta Institute of Technology in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. In this role, she supports strategic decision-making through conscientious stewardship and critical evaluation of library data. Her current research interests include using data visualization for assessment and communication and promoting inclusion and diversity in LIS. And Maureen Strub joined the University of Louisville Libraries faculty in 2013 after receiving her MS in information from the University of Michigan. As the Assessment User Experience Librarian, she studies how users interact with library resources, spaces, and services to provide information for planning and decision-making. She has a strong interest in user-centered design and is currently working with two other librarians on a study that investigates how students interact with online databases and other search tools. The data they collect will be used to influence the design of those search tools for a more engaging and rewarding experience. Without further ado, I will now hand it over to our panelists and let Dr. Hoffman start.
All right, thank you, Jason. And before we get too much further, we all wanted to provide our Twitter handles and the webinar hashtag in case you're interested in tweeting today. So the hashtag that we have for today is ULS, all in capital letters, and SS, all in lowercase, and then 17. And you can see each of our Twitter hashtags there. All right. Now to get started. So I'm Starr Hoffman, and to give you some context about the place I'm speaking from in planning, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about my position. So I'm Director of Planning and Assessment at the UNLV Libraries, and my time is split between coordinating assessment across the libraries and doing strategic activities, mostly planning activities. UNLV is an urban public university that's research focused. We have about 29,000 students and about 50 librarians, and we have strong programs in music and hospitality. So when each of us speak today, we're going to mention how you can apply these assessment concepts to both small and large scale assessments. So I'll talk about those briefly. An example of a small scale assessment is something that is a contained project, usually involves just one or two parts of the library, probably involves only a few people, and is of limited time and scope. So an example might be assessing faculty satisfaction with information literacy instruction. This could take the form of a short 3-question survey, for instance. So to contrast, a large-scale assessment usually involves multiple parts of the library or is broad in scope. It may involve a lot of people, and it often has a whole bunch of results, and thus the analysis stage is a lot more involved. So an example of this could be an ethnographic space study where people walk around making observations of how people use library space. This is particularly true if you're doing an observation study of several spaces in the library, but regardless, because observation studies tend to produce a whole bunch of results and take a lot of analysis, they're typically considered large-scale projects. So I've focused this part of planning with small assessments in mind, but a lot of these principles hold true for larger projects as well. So first, start out by finding your stakeholders for this assessment and discuss the goals that they have for this assessment. Don't assume that you know why they want to assess something. Find out what their why is. And to get to this, it's helpful to often have just a kind of stock list of questions that you can ask stakeholders. Some of these questions might be, what do you want to know and why do you want to know it? How do you plan to use this assessment to make change? And what are your barriers or pain points? You can also use this kind of meeting as an opportunity to do an impromptu data audit, asking stakeholders what they already collect and what they do with that data. Sometimes when you're talking to people about their data, you can find that they're not actually using it, and you can suggest that they stop collecting it. Or you could find out that they're already collecting some data or some assessment information that could be used to answer some of their questions that they hadn't thought about in that way. And next, consider 3 primary criteria that make up a good assessment. So first, is it usable? Meaning, is it something that you can actually take action on? So don't assess things that you know you can't change. It's best not to gather data or evidence that will be hard to act on or respond to. There are exceptions, but be mindful about those, and it's best to generally focus on assessments that will lead to actual improvement. If you're taking the time to make an assessment, it's best to be sure that that assessment is something that can actually make impact and change. Second criteria is the assessment realistic? This often entails looking at a project and determining whether or not it's truly a small-scale project. Don't turn a small-scale project into a large-scale project by accident. And one of these is by realizing that a project that's good enough and done is better than a project that's rigorous but incomplete. Think realistically about the amount of work involved, not just in collecting the information, but also when you're analyzing and interpreting it, which is often the most time-consuming part of an assessment project. And finally, is it sustainable? Do you think you'll do this assessment again in the future? If there's any chance at all, really think through how it would work and how it could remain useful over time. This is especially important with surveys when you may use the same question set for multiple years. And this really entails looking closely at questions and thinking about if what you want to ask over time will change, as well as are there questions that you're going to want to drop over time? This is really why I advocate for making surveys as succinct as possible and with as few questions as possible, because often over time you'll find that you want to shorten them so that you get more responses. So it's important to focus on the analysis stage early on. Analysis is really key to planning because, as I mentioned previously, it often takes the most time in the assessment cycle. And again, if you're designing a survey, think about how you'll analyze it, how you'll present it, and how you'll visualize those results. Think about what you want those results to look like while you're setting up the actual survey itself. One example of this might be we have a survey question in one of our internal employee surveys that asks employees to rank things that they like in the libraries by level of importance. And ranked questions often seem really great, like they'll produce a lot of useful data, but they're really difficult to analyze meaningfully. It's hard to meaningfully do it, but also it's just hard and time consuming to figure out how to display ranked data anyway. And this is a question that was used over time in this survey, so it becomes more difficult for us to drop it. So this kind of is a case study both of thinking about your analysis ahead of time, as well as what I was saying about longitudinal things, where if you're sustaining that survey over time, really make sure that those questions are set up how you want to analyze them. And for small-scale projects in particular, make sure the assessment size suits the project level. So again, don't add too many survey questions or make it too lengthy or difficult to analyze if it's not designed as a large-scale survey. And for many small-scale projects, quantitative results are quicker to analyze and use. Qualitative results are really valuable and provide a lot of nuance, but they often end up turning a small project into a large one. Again, with the observation space studies, they may seem like a really good choice for a small project, but they take so much time not only to run, but to analyze that they can turn large really quickly. And finally, look for examples of others doing similar assessments. So search the literature, post questions to listservs, and ask colleagues or professional contacts for examples of similar assessment projects. It's really good to start with existing surveys or even just borrow a few pre-existing survey questions in an instrument. The benefits of using something that already exists include not only saving time, but you can often then compare your results to other libraries. It's a really good practice not just to not duplicate your effort, but when possible to produce results that not only answer your questions, but contribute to the larger body of library and information science research. So now let's move on to large-scale planning. I'm going to take the mile-high view now and talk about a library-wide assessment plan. Key takeaways for planning larger projects is to spend adequate time on the planning stage, involve people at various levels, and to thoroughly define measures of success. So to look at implementing these tips, I'm going to walk you through the steps of one way to create an assessment plan for an entire library. To create an assessment plan, you need to start with the goals you want to assess. So the most obvious place to find these are in your library's strategic plan or in other documents that detail your library's goals, mission, and values. From that document, you can pull or create measures of success. So how do you know when a goal has been reached, and what does success look like? It's important to be as specific as possible. From that measure, decide how you will get that measure. This is the method of assessment. Don't just default to surveys. We're often guilty of this in libraries. But what information do you already have? This is a great opportunity to look for low-hanging fruit, data and assessments that already exist, you're already doing. How can you use those to show success and goals that you want to measure? It can help to align all this information in one place. That's really what the assessment plan is, aligning your goals, your measures of success, and your method. There's a common misconception that an assessment plan should be complete, listing all assessments throughout your library, and then it needs to be perfect and up to date. But I have to tell you, even a rough working document can be immensely helpful. Even a rough plan can clearly show the relationship of your assessments to your library's strategic plan and ideally to your institution's strategic plan. It makes it a really important document. It can also help you track all the various projects in the library, giving an overall picture of the impact your library is making. And it can serve as a really helpful outline for writing reports on your strategic plan outcomes. I did this recently when we had to write a library annual report. We literally just went down the assessment plan row by row and wrote bullet points about how we reach success in various goals. It can help communicate to the rest of the library what projects and assessments are going on. This is something that I've kind of learned over time, is how valuable an internal communication tool an assessment plan can really be. And it can help you track individuals and their roles in all of these assessment projects. So these are some examples to show how I pulled content from our strategic plan directly into the assessment plan. At the left is my library's strategic plan. And the top part lists the first institution's goal. So this is UNLV's goal around research and scholarly activities. And then in bold right below that is the related library goal. That's how we're going to meet that goal of the institutions. So each of the bulleted points below it are individual objectives or projects that accomplish that goal. And then at the very bottom of the sheet are related measures of success. So these were kind of broadly outlined to begin with in the strategic plan, which made my job a little easier. Then at the upper right of this slide is a spreadsheet. It's got the gray and white rows. And this is the first version of our assessment plan that I created. So I mapped each goal in the first column to the left to a specific measure, which is in the next column, second column over. And then the third and fourth columns show corresponding specific assessments and sometimes a related survey question. So it's very specific about, in this survey, this is the question we're using to measure this specific item. And then you'll see at the bottom of this slide in the middle is a different spreadsheet. So this is the same information as the original assessment plan, but where the original assessment plan, all the goals are grouped by thematic area. This new one has all of the individual items grouped by individual library department. So this way, it makes it really easy for a department head to look at this one spreadsheet and track all the assessments that they're specifically involved in. When creating a library-wide assessment plan, it's important to get feedback at different levels throughout the library. So I used an iterative process of feedback to help populate the plan, revise it as I got the feedback again, and then go back and seek feedback from a different level of the library, so moving both up and down in the organization. This step is really important because there might be projects and assessments at your library that you aren't aware of. And some may not be explicitly stated in the strategic plan, especially if you don't have a very granular strategic plan. Or you may know about the assessment, but there might be multiple departments involved in it, and you may not be aware of all the areas that are touching that project. So now that you've planned it out, you're ready to conduct your assessment, and I will hand the reins over to Ebony.
Thank you, Starr. This is Ebony. I have a bit of a cold, so I apologize for the sound of my voice. Before I dive into the conducting session, I'll give you a little bit of context for my institution. STATE is a public post-secondary institution. We're a polytechnic, which means we focus on applied education, and we're more about teaching and learning than research. There are 6 librarians here and about 18 staff serving a student body of 15,000 FTE. Each librarian has liaison areas, supervisory duties, and at least one quote-unquote functional area. So in my case, I'm liaison to the School of Energy, head of the UX department, which oversees our website, and the assessment librarian. On paper, assessment makes up about 40% of my role, but in practice, that varies based on time of year and demand. So in this section, I'm going to walk through the steps that I take when approaching basically any assessment project, some of which will emphasize and kind of reiterate what Starr has talked about, and then I'll share a few examples to illustrate the steps. I want to emphasize that this isn't always a linear process. I'm presenting these as discrete stages in a certain sequence, but they often lead into and influence one another, and you might not always follow this exact order. That being said, you should always start by knowing your question. So assessment at any level is usually motivated by at least a vague question or sense of what you want to find out. Do students like the library? Does it help them succeed? Are we accomplishing what we set out to do? But you'll really set yourself up for success if you spend some time honing in on and clearly defining your question. What exactly are you interested in evaluating? Is it a larger question that should be broken into smaller chunks? Are we saying one thing but meaning another? For anyone who does reference, it's almost like doing a reference interview. You want to find out the true need behind the question that initially comes up. Once you know your question, you should identify your participants. And by participants, I mean both your colleagues who can help you execute the study and the population from which you hope to get your data. You may want to identify colleagues with certain skill sets to help, or you may just want people who have an interest and some time. And you do want to draw on their areas of expertise. I try to position myself as a consultant for other units, like instruction or collections, when they have projects in mind. So collaborators may actually come to me before the project begins, and I'll rely on them to bring their domain-specific knowledge to the table. In terms of the population you're studying, you really do want to think about who your target audience is. Are they in a specific program or year? Do they use the library in a particular way? This will inform your research design and your recruitment channels and methods. For me, inclusion and respect are two really important elements of working with any volunteers, especially students. So try whenever possible to ensure the diversity of your institution is represented within your study to whatever degree that is appropriate. And respect the fact that they're giving up time and labor to help you. If it's not possible to give every participant an incentive or compensation, then at the very least be transparent with them about the purpose of the study and try to check your assumptions in order to honor the information that they provide. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm just trying to advance. There we go, the slides. So the first thing I'll say about choosing your method is that you should never choose your method first. Your choice of method should be informed by the type of data, quantitative or qualitative, that can best answer your question, and the level of engagement you need with your participants to get a valuable response. There isn't necessarily a quote-unquote best method for a given type of project, but there are common or recommended ones depending on the task at hand. If you want to look at your website's usability, a survey is not your best bet. In fact, while surveys are ridiculously common, and I would agree with Starr, perhaps overused, their efficacy can be limited. If your question is a binary or a very straightforward one, and you need a lot of responses in a short space of time, then a survey might work for you. But interviews or focus groups with narrower slices of the population and with open-ended questions are likely to give you richer responses. In terms of learning about methods, I haven't found a be-all, end-all handbook, but the SAGE Research Methods database comes pretty close if your institution has a license, although it is kind of expensive. Oxford UP also has some great handbooks on research methods for different disciplines. And I think it is important to really commit to knowing a method before you set out to use it. You don't have to be a capital R researcher to use different methods or even to attempt mixing methods, but you should be honest with yourself about what you're able to do while maintaining the integrity of your work. And this is where identifying collaborators at the outset can be a boon. If I want to pilot a method that I haven't tried before, at the very least, I will talk with someone who has done it, and I will usually try to convince them to help me. So when gathering your tools and resources, this is really the stage where you are tying up all the loose ends. You're making sure you have the software, the hardware, the resources, the people, the funds to do whatever your project requires. If you're on a limited budget, it may mean figuring out what tools you have an institutional license for, or if there are open source versions. It also means deciding what you offer for incentives. And if you don't have a budget for incentives, you can consider other options. We just recently offered a week-long study room reservation during finals, and students were actually more enthusiastic about that than gift cards. So at this point, you really want to think about what you need at each stage to ensure that you will see your project through from beginning to end. So I'll jump now into some of the examples. The first one is discovery layer usability testing, which for us is really a small-scale, one-off project to answer a specific question. We use EBSCO Discovery Search, and it has these things called research starters, which are like little encyclopedia articles that pop up for some searches, and it allows you to display LibGuides that may be relevant based on search terms. One day, our collections librarian, who also administers the discovery layer, asked if we should get rid of the research starters and move or get rid of the LibGuides and the search results. So I suggested that we do some usability testing before making that decision. The question started, should we get rid of these? But really the question we're asking in our testing is, are these help features useful to students? So I'm working with the collections librarian because he initiated the project and he is the decision-making stakeholder. And I'm also working with our web development technician who's a member of the UX team. For the student participants, we're particularly interested in students in our degree and diploma programs as opposed to our apprenticeship programs, since they're more likely to be doing research or assignments. And ideally, we want to see students from a variety of programs across the disciplines. We're doing in-person moderated task-based usability testing, which basically just means we're giving students scenarios and tasks to complete, and we're screencasting their actions and asking them to narrate their thought process while one of us observes and takes notes. And we're primarily going to use qualitative analysis to code the test, though we will include some quantitative measures around completion rate. For the screencasting, we're using Camtasia because we already have it. We're creating the scenario task scripts ourselves. We've identified a budget of up to $200 to supply incentives, in this case, gift cards. And we don't actually have a usability testing room, but we are going to use an empty office that is spacious enough for 3 people to comfortably sit. So the next project I'll talk about is our student survey. It is a legacy project that provides data that are used throughout the year in various ways. Before I started working at State a couple years ago, the library ran this student survey annually, and it essentially measured our popularity among students. Are we nice? Do they like us? But it asked way more questions than that. So I refocused it, and the purpose it now serves is to work as a benchmarking tool. We run it only every 2 years, and the questions, of which there are fewer, focus on how the library enables student learning and on areas of actionable change. It sounds kind of weird, but State Marketing is a partner on this one. They have a small team of really talented research analysts, and they are technically the only department that has permission to mass email students. So I provide the questions, they build the survey, and send it out. And they also do our initial bulk statistical analysis. Typically, we send the survey to all students, but I've been looking into whether or not we might want to experiment with different sampling methods for the 2018 instance of this. So it is typically web deployed. Students get the link via an email, or they can find it on the library website. This year, though, I am also looking into doing a light version where students answer a smaller selection of random questions, so that's where the sampling needs to come in. And we're going to play around with asking people in person to complete the survey on an iPad around campus. For the tools for this one, it's really just a lot of software. We have a bigger budget for incentives, usually upwards of $400 or $500 for draws. And of course, time and people are hugely important for this one. And with this project, I want to highlight the fact that it has a legacy, but it still requires continuous evaluation as to whether or not it's meeting our needs and worth our time and worth our students' time. So the final one I'll talk about is space planning. This was a new request that we received on somewhat short notice, and the results need to be scalable and sustainable. So we've always had space planning on our minds, as most people do, but we recently were asked to submit a master space plan with the expectation that large-scale priority projects, like blowing up our information desk, might be completed in the next year or 2. This came along with a change in administration. So the library director is a major player in this project since ultimately she's the decision maker. Facilities management is a necessary partner to get anything approved. And our access services team has been tapped to help with some of the new data collection that we're doing. We have to balance a lot of very different stakeholder needs here, considering all the different people and groups that are using the library. But we're very firm on the fact that on-campus students are the priority here. So for methods, we're going to use ethnographic methods to observe student use of the space and collect data about occupancy and type of usage at different times of day. But because we're only starting that basically this month, we won't have a lot of data to go on. So we're also looking to existing data sources that we might examine differently to gain insight about student space usage. And Starr mentioned this a bit, but when I'm considering a new assessment project, I will often first think about whether or not we already collect data or have information that can answer the question before I invest time in a new research design. For the tools and resources on this one, I just listed the ones associated with the new data collection. So we're using NCSU's open source tool Summa, and I am a Tableau adherent, so I do the data analysis and visualization using that program. And I should mention most of our existing data sources live in SpringShare apps like LibCal or LibInsight. And with that, I will pass it over to Marini for communication.
Great. Just to give you a little bit of background about my institution, I'm at the University of Louisville. We are a public institution that's primarily undergraduate, so with a little over 22,000 students. And we also have some professional schools in dentistry, medicine, nursing. And here at U of L, my position is part of library administration, where I conduct, or at the very least consult on assessment-related activities for 5 libraries. I also run and coordinate the student advisory board here, and I'm in part of the design and the dissemination of our biennial benchmark survey. So I'll give you a second to read this quote. When I read this for the first time, it really resonated with me. As assessment professionals, we can collect a bunch of data, but when it comes to communicating about data, data in and of itself is not really information. It only tells part of the story, so it needs to be analyzed. It needs to be looked at from multiple perspectives, and only then can we then begin to form a complete picture, right, by giving that data context and looking at it in relation to other data, and then also by interpreting it so we can make sense of it so that we can effectively communicate about it. With this sense-making comes some filtering of data to what is interesting, and by interesting meaning not just to you, but what is interesting to your audience, and what is compelling. When we talked about planning and conducting assessment earlier, we talked about the importance of understanding your stakeholders' mindsets and goals. Knowing this and having it clearly defined is key to helping you provide data that helps them tell their story. Knowing how they're going to communicate about the data, both up and down the food chain, so to campus administrations and even within the library, the organization, shapes not only what findings you share, but how you present those findings. As much as assessment professionals love being immersed in all the data, your stakeholders don't have time for all the data and just need data that helps them convey a compelling story. If you want your data to be easily or readily adopted, you have to make it readily digestible. As you're collecting your data, do some preliminary analysis so that you can update your stakeholders. In so doing, you can start to have conversations about the data you thought a process was going to get, and you can work to identify where and if there are still gaps. Although you have the expertise in the process, it can help you see what's still missing for your stakeholders as they build their cases or their stories. Finally, communicating early in the process can also inform your recommendations in the analysis phase of your data presentation. Once you know who your audience is, it helps to step back and think about how you'll put the data you have into context for that audience. By understanding the mindset of our audience on the issue at hand, you can begin to understand what will be important and resonate with them. So ask yourself questions like, how can you frame the results in language that they can understand? Just as important, you'll need to learn what will be compelling about your data and why should your audience care. And if you're asking for support, you'll want to ask yourself what data will they need to make their decision. So for example, when making a case on campus, it's important to make sure that we're aligning our assessment efforts in terms of interest to our administrators. We look at how a specific request moves a strategic campus priority forward and not just how it helps the library. That can be a more compelling way to frame the issue. So putting the request in the context of the university's strategic plan, and Starr talked about aligning things to the library strategic plan and the university strategic plan as well, or even how it aligns with the scorecard for our president, is a much more compelling story than a story about book circulations, the number of patrons served at a reference desk, or the number of books we cataloged that year. We're seeing more and more attempts across the board to address these type of scorecards and to provide information that helps show the value of what we do relative to our funding authorities. So think about things like retention, graduation rates, the value of subscriptions or databases toward the research and scholarly output, and framing your data using that lens. In my role as a UX and assessment librarian, after making sense of the data, I sometimes identify conceptual solutions or make recommendations for how the user experience could be improved. In some cases, our data explicitly tells us user-contributed solutions or provides a very clear path for solutions. When the solutions are high cost, and not just in dollars and cents, but things that require substantive organizational and cultural changes, we use our data to develop a path for closing the loop on our assessment. For instance, when I report data, I'll give low, medium, and high risk or cost recommendations. We then share that with our users so they know that we're acting on the data that they took the time to provide. And here's what that path forward looks like. It might not be the pie-in-the-sky recommendation that they asked for initially, but we show them how we're working towards resolving the issue. As you're developing your message, you'll want to tailor it for your specific audience. Know that the value of any particular data may not be the same for everyone. Will it be going to students, to donors, or to your campus administration? A donor may be willing to read an entire story in your publication about how a new service helps students, but you'll be lucky to get your provost or president to quickly skim your message. Similarly, your story may vary based on academic discipline, and it can often vary based on the status of the individual. For instance, in a survey that we conducted, we looked at comments respondents provided about our library spaces. In that survey, only 14% of the faculty members provided general comments about our spaces, as did only 20% of graduate students. Compare that to the 50% of our undergraduate students who mentioned spaces, and it was clear that data relative to our spaces would most resonate with those undergraduates. In this case, what we communicate with students is often going to look different from what we communicate to faculty. Overall, my goal with any message is to focus on the particular audience and the data available to craft as succinct but convincing message as possible. Finally, you'll want to consider what format would be most effective for your message. I'm not going to tell you anything too groundbreaking, but your two basic choices are verbal messages or print and electronic messages. Verbal messages might take place as a formal presentation or an informal meeting, while print and electronic messages could be in a print donor newsletter, a blog post, or on a website, or even on social media. While we usually try more than one media, as different people respond differently, interestingly, when we asked members of our student and faculty advisory boards last year what was their preferred method of communication, they both said to use email, just not too many. Once you know who your audience is and how you might create an effective context for your message, you need to decide what kind of story you'll be telling. Is it strictly matter of fact? Are you trying to persuade? Are you looking to tell a positive story? When we were working on writing our accreditation self-study, Our dean made it clear up front that we weren't trying to be comprehensive in the data we use, but we were looking to provide data that would substantiate how the library was supporting the campus. Starr talked earlier about keeping planning realistic and its impact on change. Similarly, when you're communicating about assessment, it pays to stay realistic about what you hope to accomplish and keep focusing on how the data you have can be used to advance your goal. Generally, doom and gloom messages don't play well, and you should probably stick to implications that are clearly borne out by the data that you have. One of the things that I have found can really bolster your data is the introduction of a human aspect. A human-based story can tell more powerful or better stories. As an assessment professional with a strong UX background, I'm a huge evangelist for working with qualitative data. As Starr mentioned, qualitative data can scale up to large projects, but its power is that it allows us to build those human-based stories. As Arianna Huffington said, people think in stories, not statistics. In addition to telling or crafting a persuasive message, you might also be using the data for more promotional efforts that feed into marketing and branding opportunities. It can be an attempt to educate folks on what you do particularly well and showcasing library activities or resources. It can also be an effort to get in front of what might be perceived as bad news or publicity. For instance, I just finished an infographic for our donor newsletter called "The Best Things of Life Aren't Free, Library Costs in the Real World." In this case, we knew that showing a chart wouldn't be particularly helpful or interest-grabbing or compelling, and we still had to honor our vendor contracts need for confidentiality about how much we pay for stuff. But by comparing those costs to things that were contextually important by our region and audience, we were able to tell a story that our audience could identify with. So here in Louisville, the Kentucky Derby and athletics are a big deal and have big costs associated with them. So they were really helpful in framing the cost comparisons. About a year ago, we also started a campaign called People of Ekstrom, modeled after the Humans of New York, which I'm sure everybody's familiar with. While it's primarily a communication tool for our main library, initially, much of what came out of those interviews supported what our data was revealing, and it was another way to share data about us or about the libraries. We were intentional in who was featured, taking care to select people that helped us tell that story, the story that we wanted to convey. And in the same way that if you're familiar with any UX work, personas that are the use of personas to allow designers to empathize and internalize data about users, this campaign allowed us to talk about what we'd learned about ourselves in that same way. What I'd like to share at this point are a couple of screenshots of different artifacts that we've used in connection to a major renovation project. The first image that you'll see on your left is a screen capture of our project website. And you'll notice that we did an assessment, a pre-renovation assessment project that spanned over, I think, 5 months, where we collected data about how people use the space and their needs within the spaces. And so the report associated with that was publicly shared on a public website. We also had it was also featured in our university library newsletter. And there was also a blog post talking about the results of the assessment project and the corresponding physical changes that we'd made to the space. So tying in the physical changes to the actual data that we'd collect and the major findings. The next three slides actually are also related to this renovation project, but looking at the reallocation of that space. The first two that I'm going to show a before and after, and were more absorbable to general audience, like donors and students. And the last shows it in the form of a chart. At the time, our provost was from the School of Engineering, and responded better to this kind of representation. So here's the before and after that that shows how the user spaces actually increased before the renovation. This is what it was. After the renovation, this is what it looked like. And this is the example of the data that we knew would resonate better with our provost, coming from that engineering background. So he would want to see things like charts and tables with the actual data. Same data, just a different presentation of that data. So this brings us to the end of what we plan to cover today, and I want to thank you all for joining us and open up the floor for questions.
Thank you so much. That was great. That was really an informative presentation from everyone. We have a couple of questions here, and if you have other questions, please put them into the chat box. I'll start off. This was a question was asked while Starr was presenting, but I'll open it up first to Starr and then everybody else. You talked about aligning your strategic plan and your assessment plan. How long did that take for your library to properly align those two? I'm about a year into trying, and we're still all over the place.
That's a really good question. We were lucky in, or at least I was lucky in the case that when I joined the library strategic plan was already pretty firmly aligned within the institution's strategic plan. They had undergone a rigorous process of that, but typically we try not to spend a lot of time on the strategic planning process at UNLV because each of our plans are designed to only last 2 years to follow our funding model with the legislation. The actual act of creating the assessment plan, aligning all of the assessments with the library strategic plan, I think overall probably took me 3 months while working on other things. The main time involved in that was the iterative process that I mentioned. So, I took a stab at it initially. I got some feedback from the senior leadership team. I took it to department heads and staff across the library, processed it again, took it back to the senior leadership team. So all of those stages, took multiple weeks just to kind of go through all those people. I think it's doable within a couple months with that feedback, but the main thing that it takes, I think, is a lot of work up front by one person to try and kind of corral everybody in a single direction.
Good. Thank you. I don't know, Ebony or Marini, if you have anything you want to chime in about that.
This is Ebony. I don't think I can add much to what Starr said. I was lucky also in that I was involved in our last strategic planning, so I was able to start out with kind of keeping assessment in mind at the very beginning. And we're actually now just starting at looking into creating a balanced scorecard for my library and aligning elements of that to our divisional, the library strategic plan, our divisional strategic plan, and the state strategic plan. And we've given ourselves a nice long year timeline for deadline for that. So it is time consuming, but well worth it.
Great, thank you.
Likewise, I came into a strategic plan when I started here at UofL, so that made it easier for me to start mapping the data that we were collecting to those things. The university right now, the university strategic plan is a little bit in flux right now. We are going through some leadership changes, and we're near the end of one of our, we have 2 strategic plans, but we're near the end of one of them, and so until we have like a new president on board, when we have a new president on board, I expect that to change a little bit. So I'm sure that will reframe some of the things that we focus on as well.
And there's a lot going on at the University of Louisville right now.
Yeah.
If you don't keep up with the news and with sports news as well. So there's a lot on the president's plate. Yeah. Do you all have any recommendations for data visualization tools that are easy to use?
Ebony, you want to chime in on this one?
This is Ebony, and I think Starr will back me up on this one. Starr and I both use Tableau a lot. I think we actually met over a year ago, both presenting on Tableau.
Yep.
It involves, it's easy once you've got the hang of it, and it is a friendly interface. It does involve some time up front to really get to know the environment. One of the nice things about Tableau, they have a free public version, you just have to remember that using that one, your data are saved on their server, so you don't want to be using any confidential or personally identifying data. I would say Tableau is a good one to invest your time in because it's used throughout the library community so much. But I also still use Excel sometimes if it will fit my needs.
Yeah, I second that. Sometimes, you know, Excel is just, especially if you're doing one of those small scale projects, you're doing something quick and dirty, it may just be better to use that. Or another thing that I do with a lot of our smaller surveys, you know, if it's not a big once every 2 or 3 years user survey, it's just kind of a one-off. We use Qualtrics to collect that data. Qualtrics has great built-in reporting capabilities, and it's awesome to just be able to download that PDF and send it out to people and not spend, you know, hours analyzing that in Tableau. So sometimes that's a really good built-in tool.
As somebody who has been a long admirer of Tableau, but recently, like in the last month, actually had my first foray into it, I have joined that evangelist bunch. I have not used it as yet for any projects, but I would like to echo what Ebony was sharing about Excel doing just, I mean, think about what data visualization is. It's charts and it's charts. And so I think that you can still get a lot done with Excel. And I actually use PowerPoint actually for mock-ups. So Ebony talked a little bit about doing an observation study. And so what I use PowerPoint to do was to create a heat map about where people were sitting in spaces because it was related to space renovation. And so I think depending on your budget, Tableau, yes, there's a public version of it, but you know, there's a cost barrier if you have confidentiality that you want to work with. And so Excel and PowerPoint also can be just as powerful.
Great, thank you. And I use Tableau. It's great, but it does take a lot of practice to really get the hang of it. So you guys invest some time in learning how to use it. Do any of you consult the database of past academic library assessment projects? The link goes to the Assessment in Action, which is the program from ALA and ACRL. And also adding on to that, do you have any recommendations for resources out there on the web or otherwise that people can consult when doing assessment projects or getting started?
This is Starr. I just want to give a big plug to the ARL Assess listserv. That is like the best brain trust of library assessment. It's a great place to go with any questions. And like recently, I think a week or two ago, there's a question posted, hey, I'm looking for examples of assessment plans. And then there was just this wonderful deluge of examples of plans. And I was thinking to myself, wow, why didn't I post that question 2 years ago when I was really wondering what this is supposed to look like? And the more questions I've seen posted, the more I post myself, and the more I heavily recommend it to colleagues. Not just assessment people also is the key thing. I really recommend signing up for that group and just reading through what comes through it if you're at all involved in assessment.
This is Ebony, and I absolutely wholeheartedly second what Starr has said. For the person who asked how does one join, I think if you just go to libraryassessment.org, which is the ARL assessment website, I'm pretty sure there's a link in the sidebar to join the community, but I could double check that afterwards. Basically just talking to people and going to conferences and checking these listservs, that's kind of how I keep up on things. It's a great community, and echoing what Starr said, I think everyone is really willing to share when people have questions. So there's not really a one-stop shop, I find.
I agree with Ebony, with both what Ebony and Starr shared, and there's a lot of my work since I've been here at U of L has been focused on spaces. There is, and I'm trying to find the URL for it really fast, but I'll send it out to Jason probably after the webinar. There's a Learning Spaces collaborative, which is kind of a repository about different methods you can use when you're assessing spaces that I found really helpful. And I also want to do a plug for a book that I have a chapter in. It's a library assessment cookbook that is being published by ALA and is coming out, I think, like within the next week or so, if it's not already out. available for pre-order, and what they have is something like over 40 or more, 50 or different authors talking about different assessment projects and how you can implement those particular, those ideas or these methods on assessment.
Yeah, this is Starr again, and I want to say absolutely. We just ordered that book for my library, and it's fabulous.
Oh,
and I also wanted to follow up on Ebony's comments about the Library Assessment Conference.
Oh, yeah.
That and the assessment listserv, even though they're run by ARL, just a quick note, you don't have to be in ARL to join and to use it. And also the Library Assessment Conference website is really great because you don't even have to go to their conference to read all of the past papers. They post PDFs of what people have spoken on and presented on, and it's such a goldmine of information.
And similarly, the Southeastern Library Assessment Conference, they also post their papers in a repository. So everything that's talked about at conference there is available freely to learn methods. And it's a very methods-based conference. It's not very theoretical or anything like that. So you can learn a lot of practical tips.
Great. All right. Well, thank you very much. I think it's time for us to wrap up. So I want to thank again Starr and Ebony and Marini for an excellent presentation, as well as my co-moderators Alex and Taylor. And I'd also like to thank Lois Sharp and Sophie Skinner at ACRL for their magnificent help. And remember, just a reminder, we will send out the link to the recording of this session when it's available. It should be available in a few days to a week. I did post a link in the chat box to an assessment for the program, so please take a few minutes to complete that assessment instrument. We appreciate that. And just to put some plugs in for some upcoming webinars from the ACRL ULS Professional Development Committee. We have Set Big Goals, Get Big Results at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific on December 5th. We have 20 apps in 60 minutes at 1 p.m. Eastern and 10 a.m. Pacific on January 31st. We have How to Think and Act Like a User Experience Librarian Part 2 on February 21st at 2 Eastern, 11 Pacific. And we have Free Graphics, Audio, and Video for Education, which will be on March 7th at 1 Eastern and 10 Pacific. We will be sending out links on how to register and all of that in the upcoming weeks and months as we get closer to those dates. So again, thank you very much for the presentation. Thank you for attending. We really appreciate it, and have a great day.